So imagine dying, escaping your physical body, and feeling this overwhelming, blissful sense of relief.
Oh yeah, just total freedom.
Right, only to realize that the universe actually considers the idea of coming back to Earth to be a terrifying imprisonment.
Which is wild because, we typically view physical life as our safe, comfortable home.
Yeah, full of warm beds and good meals.
Exactly. And the spiritual realm is just some abstract, cloudy unknown. We assume birth is a joy and death is a tragedy.
But the highly philosophical text we're diving into today completely inverts that script, doesn't it?
It really does.
Why
It
not?
suggests that spirits are actually terrorized by the prospect of incarnating into a physical body.
Terrorized. Wow. So welcome to today's deep dive, where our mission is to unpack this fascinating source material.
Yeah, it's a remarkably dense and, I'd say, unvarnished dialogue between a questioner and a philosophical respondent.
And it basically frames incarnation not as a joyful birth, but as a dreaded assignment.
It does. There's this one specific footnote in the text that points to an ancient ritual, the funeral of a shaman whose body was burned on a pyre.
Okay, a burning shaman, that's an intense image.
Right. But the text notes that the spirit feels a formal pleasure in abandoning the material world.
Pleasure.
Yeah, a profound gratification in being liberated from the dense weight of the body, much like that shaman's spirit escaping the burning prison of his flesh.
Wow. Okay, so if leaving the body is a liberating release from a burning prison, then entering it is, it's literally an incarceration.
That's exactly it. The text leans into a very visceral metaphor here.
It compares the physical body and really the entire earthly experience to an armor that is too tight.
An armor that is too tight. I love that phrasing.
Yeah, it references old warriors who had to wear these massive, rigid iron suits.
Right. The armor kept them alive in battle,
Yeah.
sure, but the warriors suffered immensely inside them.
Because the metal was so heavy, inflexible, and fundamentally limiting?
And that limitation is not just a matter of physical clumsiness, like lacking the ability to fly or needing to pause for sleep.
Right. It goes deeper than that.
Oh, way deeper.
Yeah.
The text describes a profound reduction of the self.
How so?
Well, the spirit is forced to relinquish its vast inherent intelligence, its expansive powers, and its total freedom.
Just to exist here.
Yeah, merely to focus narrowly on one specific, localized physical experience.
Okay, so if the spirit has to cram all of its infinite awareness into a dense physical form, it sounds like, well, it's like taking a state-of-the-art quantum supercomputer
Okay, I like this.
and forcing its consciousness to run entirely inside a 1990s pocket calculator.
Oh, man. Yes.
You go from simulating the physics of entire galaxies to being restricted to spelling out words upside down on a tiny LCD screen.
Exactly. You lose almost all your processing power just to exist in that plastic shell.
Which sounds awful.
The respondent in the text actually describes this state as the spirit feeling like the victim of a counterfeiting.
A counterfeiting, so like it's fake.
Yeah, it's true. Expansive nature is masked and distorted by the biological vehicle.
Huh.
It is thrust into this ambiguous, frustrating existence where it feels literally tied hand and foot to the body.
You are taking the infinite and forcing it to operate strictly through the finite?
Right.
But forcing a supercomputer into a pocket calculator doesn't produce anything useful, right? It just throttles the system.
Yeah, it sounds completely counterproductive.
So if the restriction is that agonizing, I cannot imagine any spirit willingly signing up for it unless there is absolutely massive payoff on the other side.
Oh, there has to be.
Like, there has to be a functional reason for enduring that level of claustrophobia.
And there is. The functional reason is the core mechanism of this entire philosophy, something the respondent calls the dialectical clash.
The dialectical clash?
Okay. The heavy armor of the physical body is not a punishment handed down by a cruel universe. It operates as an engine.
Okay, but engines need fuel and combustion to create forward momentum. Where is the momentum coming from if the spirit is trapped?
It comes from friction.
Friction.
Yeah, the text explains that the spirit, in its natural, newly created state, is fundamentally static.
Static, like it's not moving.
Exactly. The specific terminology translates to being at rest or immobile.
Okay.
It is imbued with immense divine potential, but that potential is entirely dormant. It is just sitting there in a state of passive existence.
So it's like a high-capacity battery sitting in a drawer.
Well, that's a good way to put it.
It has the potential energy to power something incredible, but until you plug it into a circuit and introduce resistance, nothing actually happens.
Right. The energy remains trapped as mere potential.
So the physical universe is that circuit.
Yes. And the heavy armor. is the resistance.
Mhm.
To grow, the spirit must be forced into motion.
And the only way to induce that motion is by colliding the static spirit with the hard universe of knowledge, evidence, and physical laws.
Bingo. This collision is the dialectical clash.
Let's break down that word, dialectical, because
Yeah.
it's doing a lot of heavy lifting here.
It really is.
Usually, a dialectic involves two opposing forces, like a thesis and an antithesis, crashing into each other to create a brand new synthesis.
That is the exact mechanism at play here. The thesis is the spirit, infinite in its potential, seeking freedom, but completely static and unformed.
And the antithesis.
The material universe, dense, highly restrictive, bound by unforgiving laws, and incredibly heavy.
Right.
When you force the thesis into the antithesis, when you shove the infinite spirit into the tight armor of a physical body, the resulting violent tension forces the spirit to wake up.
It has to struggle against the limits.
Exactly. It's the ultimate form of resistance training.
Resistance training, yeah, like a muscle floating in zero gravity just atrophies because there is no opposing force.
That's a perfect analogy.
The physical world provides the gravity, the tight armor provides the weight.
And that resistance training is evolution.
Wow.
The text insists that without this continuous dialectical collision between the spirit that is and the outside reality that must be known, the spirit would remain forever static.
It characterizes this struggle as a clash between the creature and creation, or even between the spirit and God.
Yeah, battling the universe to force your own growth.
That's intense.
The ultimate goal of all this friction is what the respondent calls the reappropriation of the divine.
Reappropriation of the divine.
Right. The spirit is intrinsically a divine being, but at the moment of its creation, that divinity is merely a seed.
It's just potential.
Exactly. Having divinity as a dormant potential is vastly different from possessing it as an active realized state.
Right, you have to earn it.
Yes. Through the dialectical clash, the spirit fights to earn its own inherent divinity. It turns the raw potential it was handed into an actualized reality it has built for itself.
Okay, I have to step in and look at this from a human perspective.
Sure.
Because while the concept of earning your divinity sounds incredibly epic, the day-to-day reality of it sounds relentlessly bleak.
Oh, absolutely. The perpetual grind.
Exactly. If our entire existence requires this harsh, endless clash, this constant friction against the physical world, it sounds like an exhausting, eternal slog.
Like you're just exhausted all the time.
Yeah, it feels like the myth of Sisyphus pushing the massive boulder up the mountain, knowing that every time he nears the top, the boulder will roll back down.
And there will just be another mountain to climb tomorrow.
Right. If we are constantly trapped in this state of relativity where we never possess the full, absolute picture of the universe, it implies there is never a moment of rest.
Never a moment of true peace or certainty.
Yes, exactly.
Well, the questioner in the source material shares that exact human fear.
Really?
Yeah, they ask the respondent, if we are always existing in the relative, always operating in doubt, always clashing against our limits, isn't that just endlessly stressful?
And what do they say?
This is the moment where the text completely flips the narrative, moving from a paradigm of suffering to one of profound, inherent joy.
This shift totally caught me off guard when I read it. The text completely redefines what it actually means to live in the relative.
It strips away the negative connotation we usually attach to it.
Because we assume that if a truth is relative or incomplete compared to the vast infinity of the universe, it must be inherently flawed or unsatisfying.
But the respondent argues the opposite. Existing in the relative does not mean living in agonizing uncertainty.
What does it mean then?
It means possessing a truth that is absolutely certain, real, and completely fulfilling for your specific evolutionary level.
Okay, let's translate this into an experience anyone who has ever played a massively multiplayer video game will understand.
Oh, I love this analogy.
Imagine you are playing a game with hundreds of levels, intricately designed landscapes, and incredibly complex mechanics. When you first start, you are at level 1.
Very basic.
Right. Your abilities are limited, your perspective is narrow, and your armor is basically made of cardboard.
The tight armor of the beginner.
Exactly. But when you fight your way through the early challenges and finally conquer level 5, you don't sit there in front of the screen weeping in agony because you haven't seen the final boss at level 100.
Right. You're not upset about what you haven't seen.
Beating level 5 is genuinely, intensely fulfilling. The mastery you achieved at that stage perfectly satisfies your evolutionary level as a player in that exact moment.
The truth you acquire at level 5 is solid and real. You aren't mourning the infinity of the game you haven't explored yet.
You are energized by the reality you have just mastered.
And when you reach level 6, the challenges change, the friction increases, and you have to adapt again.
But the process of figuring it out isn't a tragic slug. It's exactly why you are playing the game.
Exactly. This is why the text radically redefines the evolutionary search for knowledge. It refuses to call it a burden.
It calls it, what was the phrase?
La felicità dell'andare, the happiness of the journey, or the joy of the going.
The joy of the going. I like that.
The act of discovery, the process of verifying reality through the dialectical clash, and the resulting expansion of the self are intrinsically joyful to the spirit. Evolution is fundamentally a happy process.
But wait, we can't just gloss over the reality of human suffering?
Sure point.
Philosophy is great until you get fired from your job, or a relationship shatters, or you experience profound grief.
Yeah, real life hits hard.
The text doesn't deny that the earthly experience can be pure agony. So if the baseline of evolution is this happy journey, where does all the undeniable human misery come from?
The text makes a careful distinction here. The true nature of the spirit in motion is joyful, but acute suffering occurs when the spirit falls into a dialectical trap.
A trap. So getting stuck on a puzzle where the friction stops producing forward momentum and just starts burning you out.
Precisely. A dialectical trap happens when the spirit fails a specific evolutionary goal or misinterprets the reality in front of it.
Or it becomes entirely obsessed with the dense materialization of the world, rather than the knowledge that materialization is supposed to provide.
Yes.
I think we see this constantly in modern life. Imagine someone who ties their entire identity, their complete sense of self-worth, to a specific career or startup company.
Oh, definitely. They pour their infinite spirit into this very finite, rigid corporate structure.
Right, they are heavily invested in the materialization.
And when that startup fails or they lose the job, they feel like they are literally dying.
They suffer immensely because they have misinterpreted the reality. They mistook the temporary suit of armor, the job title, for their actual self.
They fell into the trap of believing the finite world was the absolute truth.
It's devastating.
The respondent beautifully describes this state of suffering as a dimming of the spirit's internal light.
The light turns off.
When you're in a dialectical trap, yeah, the light begins to turn off. You feel disconnected, exhausted, and enveloped in a dark whirlpool of material concerns.
Which feels totally hopeless when you are in the middle of it.
But the text offers a massive counterweight to that hopelessness.
Right.
It insists that the spirit always possesses the internal capacity to react. Always. Because its inherent nature is motion, it has an intimate internal power that allows it to reignite its own light.
So it can recognize the misinterpretation, pull itself out of the whirlpool, and resume its happy journey.
Yes. The suffering is not the permanent condition of the spirit. It is a temporary disconnection from its forward momentum.
Okay, so we have this profound starting point of the infinite spirit being crammed into the tight armor of a physical body.
Right.
We have the dialectical clash providing the necessary friction to force that static spirit into evolutionary motion.
Yep.
We know the journey is fundamentally a process of joyful leveling up, interrupted by occasional dialectical traps that cause suffering until we reignite our light.
That's the summary so far.
So where does this whole mechanism eventually lead us? Are we just destined to bounce endlessly from lesson to lesson, falling into traps and climbing back out forever?
Well, there is a definitive turning point in the text. The respondent points to a massive evolutionary milestone where the spirit transitions from a phase of sporadic suffering and trial and error into a highly conscious, compact process.
What do they call this milestone?
The text calls it self-identification.
Self-identification. In psychology, that sounds like a person finally finding themselves after a tumultuous adolescence.
It is the metaphysical equivalent of that exact process. Self-identification is the moment the spirit fully realizes its immortal role and comprehends its own eternal structure.
Wow.
It stops operating entirely from a base of reactive relativity and anchors itself in the solid certainty of its own eternal identity.
The source uses an incredibly striking metaphor to visually anchor this shift, and I think it brings the whole deep dive together.
The clay metaphor, right?
Yeah, it compares the spirit before this milestone to wet clay.
Wet clay is pliable. It is crumbly. It lacks a definitive internal structure.
Right, and because of that, a spirit in the wet clay phase is much less differentiated from the universe around it.
Which means it is constantly at the mercy of this dialectical clash. If the heavy armor of the physical world pushes against wet clay, the clay deforms.
It is shaped entirely by the external pressures, societal expectations, physical limitations, the fear of death.
It suffers because it is constantly being squashed and stretched by the world.
But after the realization of self-identification, the text says the spirit undergoes a profound transformation.
It becomes like baked clay. The specific phrase is secca y cauda, dry and baked.
Fired in the kiln of existence.
Exactly. It is no longer crumbly. It is no longer malleable to every passing pressure. It achieves self-sufficiency, unity, and an unbreakable inner strength.
That sounds incredibly freeing.
The text explains that from this point of baked clay onward, the spirit begins an experience that is entirely programmed and autonomous.
It compares this state to a child who has finally learned to walk on its own.
Yes, stepping forward with its eyes wide open, fully aware of its destination.
I want to look at how this changes the initial problem we discussed. We started this deep dive with the terror of incarnation.
The dread of being squeezed into the tight armor.
Right, the pocket calculator restricting the supercomputer. If reaching this baked clay phase represents the ultimate goal, does it mean we finally get to take the armor off?
Do the physical limitations just disappear?
Yeah, once you realize who you are.
Well, no. The physical world, with its dense reality and hard rules, still exists. The armor does not vanish.
But the baked clay spirit's relationship to that armor fundamentally changes, right?
Exactly. When you are wet clay, you believe you are the armor, or you allow the armor to dictate your shape entirely.
You feel crushed by it.
But when you are baked clay, your internal structure is solid. If someone hurls an insult at baked clay, or a career fails, or a physical limitation presents itself, the external pressure just clinks against the ceramic and falls away.
You are no longer being deformed by the physical world.
Right. Instead, you are wearing the armor consciously. You are using the physical environment autonomously to further your own intentional evolution.
So the tight armor ceases to be a terrifying prison and simply becomes the specific terrain you are choosing to navigate.
That's beautifully said. It is a phenomenal reframing of the entire human condition.
We moved from the terrifying claustrophobia of entering the physical world, exploring how the spirit loses its vast freedom and feels artificially reduced.
But we discovered the mechanical necessity of that reduction.
Right.
The static, dormant potential of the spirit requires the heavy resistance of the physical universe to spark the dialectical clash. We need the friction to force us into motion.
To ultimately earn our own actualized divinity. And we learn that this evolutionary grind isn't a tragedy, it's a happy journey.
We find total fulfillment in mastering the relative truths of our current level.
And when we occasionally fall into the dark whirlpools of dialectical traps, we possess the internal power to reignite our own light.
Until the relentless friction of those clashes finally fires the wet, reactive clay of our early spiritual state into something solid.
We emerge as baked clay.
Autonomous, unified, and free from the fear of the very armor we are wearing.
Which brings this entire metaphysical framework right down to the reality you are experiencing today. The next time you feel completely constrained by a situation, whether it's a suffocating job, a gridlocked commute, or a deep personal failure, remember the mechanism of the pocket calculator.
Yeah, the friction you're feeling isn't the universe punishing you.
It is the dialectical clash necessary to force your supercomputer spirit to focus, to push back, and to grow. You are just wet clay enduring the kiln.
The suffering isn't a permanent sentence, it's a temporary trap, a misinterpretation of reality that you have the inherent strength to overcome.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to carry forward.
Think about this.
If the physical world is nothing more than a temporary, narrow suit designed to focus your attention on specific, necessary lessons through friction.
What if?
What if the biggest, most agonizing obstacle in your life right now isn't actually a roadblock? What if it is the exact custom-designed curriculum your spirit deliberately chose to